So, when you think about the ancient Mediterranean world for a second, your mind probably goes straight to uh, Greece, maybe
Ah,
Rome, maybe Egypt,
yeah,
right?
the usual suspects.
Exactly.
Mm.
But what about that bit right at the northwestern tip of Africa? The Tangier Peninsula in Morocco.
Hmm.
It's sitting right there. I mean, practically looking across the water at Europe. A
Mm.
natural gateway, you could say, between the Atlantic and the Med.
It absolutely is. And that position, that geography, it's precisely why it's so fascinating. It's far from being some, forgotten corner. It was right in the thick of ancient movements,
Right.
connections.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got some really interesting stuff here. Recent archaeological reports talking about brand new finds, and also a study that's just come out in the African Archaeological Review.
Hmm.
So our mission really is to try and understand the ritual landscapes of this intriguing place, specifically between, about 3,000 and 500 BC, based on this evidence?
Exactly. And if you kind of zoom out a bit, this whole area west of Egypt, it's still one of the least understood parts of the Mediterranean, really.
Yeah.
So focusing on the Tangier Peninsula gives us this chance to maybe challenge some old ideas, and
Wow.
maybe uncover some surprising links.
Okay, let's get into it then. What are these initial discoveries that are starting to shift things?
Well, there's been recent field work ongoing, actually, by archaeologists from Spain and Morocco, and they've turned up some really remarkable stuff. Three ancient cemeteries, for starters,
Right?
and one of these is particularly interesting. It has a stone burial that's been dated to about 4,000 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, so roughly 2000 BC, using radiocarbon dating, the method they use for dating old organic stuff.
2000 BC, that is going way back. What else did they find? Anything else major?
Oh, yeah. Alongside the cemeteries, they located several rock shelters, and these had painted art inside.
Painted art. Okay.
And maybe the most visually striking thing, standing stones,
Right.
megaliths, including one really impressive one that's about 2.5 meters tall.
Standing stones. Rock art.
Yeah.
You can almost picture the people, can't you? And inside these cemeteries, I think you mentioned a specific kind of burial.
Yes, that's right. Cyst burials. Basically, imagine placing a body carefully into a hole that's been cut right into the rock
Okay.
and then covering it over with stone slabs. What's really amazing is just thinking about the sheer effort involved, with the kind of limited tools they would have had.
Yeah, you can just imagine the work.
Mm.
Hard work. And I think one of these cyst burials gave us a really key piece of dating info.
Absolutely. That was a big one. They managed to get a radiocarbon date from human remains found with one of the cyst burials, and it came back right around 2000 BC.
Right.
And this is really significant because it's actually the first time a cyst burial in Northwest Africa has been directly dated using radiocarbon. It properly places this tradition in the early Bronze Age.
Okay, so that gives us a much clearer timeline, a solid anchor point. Now, the rock art you mentioned.
Yeah.
What can those paintings tell us? Is there anything specific?
Well, the study points out some really intriguing similarities between shapes found in these shelters and ancient art found way out in the Sahara Desert.
Really? Yes, the Hera.
Yeah, which suggests, potential connections, maybe even a shared sort of symbolic language across these areas that seem quite far apart now. And the standing stones, the researchers think they were likely used to mark territory, by these ancient communities.
Marking territory. Maybe ritual significance too, you wonder.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of brings us to the bigger picture here. These aren't just isolated finds stuck in Morocco, are they?
Oh, not at all. The study really hammers home the importance of the Tangier Peninsula's connectivity. It suggests these ritual landscapes, the cemeteries, the art, the stones, they're much more interconnected, more widespread than we maybe thought. And importantly, they find really close parallels in late prehistoric southern Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, and as I said, the Sahara.
So we're looking at connections, a network almost, stretching across what we now see as these big continental divides.
Precisely. And that radiocarbon date we mentioned from the Derua Zeta cyst, that's a key piece of the puzzle. It directly challenges some older historical ideas and, maybe more importantly, it pushes us to reevaluate some colonial-era assumptions.
Yeah.
Biases that have definitely influenced how North African archaeology has been studied in the past.
Right. It sounds like maybe this region hasn't always gotten the archaeological attention it deserved. Why is that? What were the hurdles?
Yeah, several things, unfortunately. Rapid urban development is a big one. It's led to the loss of many sites, some known, probably many unknown. Political and economic instability in the region hasn't helped either. And sadly, looting. Locally, they call it suwasa. It's been a persistent, damaging problem.
Looting is always just Heartbreaking for understanding the
It
past.
really is. And then there's the historical research focus. During the colonial period, researchers were mainly interested in the Roman era.
Uh,
So that tended to overshadow the earlier periods, the pre-Roman stuff. There was some study of dolmen-like burials. That was kind of an exception. But even that research, it suffered from, well, a lack of precise dating, and it often relied on these potentially iffy colonial terms like Copper Age, Bronze Age, because they just didn't have the radiocarbon data back then.
so, like, trying to build a jigsaw puzzle, but with missing pieces, maybe some pieces labeled wrong, but now we're zeroing in on this specific crucial time, 3000 to 500 BC. The ritual landscape, then. Why is this period so important for Tangier?
Well, this period really throws that geographic importance into sharp relief, the peninsula as a connection point. And what's so fascinating is the sheer variety of burial traditions you see packed into this relatively small area. You've got cave burials, pit burials, these cyst burials we talked about.
All at the same time, or overlapping?
Overlapping, certainly, and existing alongside rock art, these megalithic monuments. And crucially, these aren't just local quirks. They have strong parallels, echoes in Atlantic Europe and down into the Sahara. So the study really pushes for an integrated view, seeing all these things, burials, art, monuments, as connected parts of a bigger symbolic ritual world. This mix suggests a lot of cultural exchange, maybe different groups coexisting, keeping their own traditions, not just one single culture.
So the geography itself, being a crossroads, is fundamental. Can you paint a bit more of a picture of that setting? How did it help these connections happen?
Okay, so the Tangier Peninsula, it's about 8,000 square kilometers, right? It forms the African side of the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow bit of water separating Africa and Europe, only about 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest.
Tiny.
Yeah, and it's bordered by both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, so it's this crucial maritime and land crossroads. Ecologically, it's pretty diverse, too. You've got a sandstone Atlantic coast and then a limestone Mediterranean side that probably influenced where people settled, what resources they had.
And how did that geography specifically affect movement interaction?
Well, by sea, there was what's called the Ibero-Moroccan Gulf. That would have been important for ancient sailors. And researchers have used GIS analysis, digital mapping, to figure out likely land routes, key communication corridors, crossroads within the peninsula.
Wow. Okay.
And interestingly, a lot of the important ritual sites, including these newly found cemeteries and rock art spots, they are located right at these identified crossroads.
Makes sense.
We also see evidence like the Cock Couch farming settlement from the late 3rd to early 1st millennia BC. That points to wider connections. And we know there was shared material culture, tools, and pottery styles with southern Iberia way back in the late Stone Age. And then the spread of Neolithic farming practices shows that connectivity, probably by sea, was really increasing.
It really paints a picture of a dynamic hub, not some edge-of-the-world place. Now, let's dig into those burial traditions more. What's the kind of long-term view? How did cemeteries change from, say, 8,000 BC up to 500 BC?
Okay, the very earliest evidence for burial in the peninsula is from Hatab II cave. That goes back to around 8900 BP before present, so yeah, very old.
Why?
Then there's a site called Gar Kahal, maybe from a similar time, but the context isn't quite as clear. Moving into the early Neolithic, we start seeing burials in caves and in open-air spots, and then in the middle and final Neolithic, that's roughly 4,500 to 3,000 BC, people seem to prefer caves and these open-air cemeteries, like Kef el Barud or the really big one at Razi Sharat.
So different ways of burying the dead right from early on.
Okay.
Okay, let's narrow down again to that late Holocene, 3000 to 500 BC. Those cave, pit, and especially cyst burials. Let's start with caves in that period.
Right. Well, for the early part of the 3rd millennium BC, we actually don't have much evidence for cave burials in the Tangier Peninsula itself. It's a bit of a gap. But later on, say between about 2470 and 1450 BC, we do find them. Sites like El Kilsi, Benzu, Hafid II. And what's interesting is that Benzu and Hafid II are near Jebel Musa, one of the ancient pillars of Hercules, a place with huge symbolic weight. And it seems like these burials might mirror practices happening right across the street in Gibraltar caves.
A shared practice across the water in this really symbolic spot. Okay, what about pit burials then?
There's a potential beaker burial that's linked to a specific pottery style, roughly 2500-2200 BC, identified just south of our main focus area, at Sidi Slimane. Within the Tangier Peninsula proper, pit burials from this time seem to be simpler pits. Bodies placed inside, sometimes covered with stone slabs, sometimes extended, maybe sometimes flexed or curled up. And intriguingly, some of these pit burials might have actually been part of larger cemeteries that also included cysts.
Okay.
We found some interesting notes in the archives of an early researcher, Cesar Montalban. He documented pit burials on the Ashakar Plateau that hadn't really been published. These were oriented north-south, had pottery with them, and likely date to the 3rd or 2nd millennia BC. And we see similar pit burials popping up in Tunisia and Iberia around the same time.
So pit burials were kind of a widespread thing across the wider region then, but the cyst burials, they seem to be a real focus of this new research, especially with that key date. Tell us more about them.
Right, the cysts. They really emerge in the Tangier Peninsula in the late 3rd millennium BC. And Darua Zaydan is our earliest dated example so far. What's notable is they seem a bit more, well, monumental compared to earlier burials, suggests more time, more resources went into making them.
Right.
Now, early researchers sometimes compared megalithic burials in Algeria and Tunisia to European dolmens. But Camps, another important researcher, argued that the Tangier cysts were different. He thought they were older and showed connections specifically to the Ibero-Atlantic world.
So he's suggesting a different origin for these Tangier cysts, linking them more to Spain, Portugal, the Atlantic coast.
Exactly. Camps linked them to beaker pottery and metal objects found in the burials, proposing that Ibero-Atlantic connection. He saw them as distinct from the later dolmens further east in the Maghreb, which he thought were influenced by contacts with Italy and Sardinia. There is an isolated dolmen at Benismassen, which hints maybe dolmens did appear earlier in North Africa, possibly Neolithic, but it's still debated. Ponsich's later work helped refine this. He distinguished between Bronze Age cysts, often trapezoid-shaped, sometimes using crescent-shaped stones, and Iron Age ones, which tended to become more rectangular and had stone heaps over them.
And how were people buried in them?
Typically flexed, so curled up, often with red ochre pigment, and grave goods pottery, sometimes tortoise shells, and metal items, things like copper awls and distinctive palmella points, which have strong parallels in Iberia.
Palmella points, right. I've heard of those.
Yeah. There's also this phenomenon of empty cysts, which has led to debate. Were they cenotaphs, like symbolic tombs? We don't know for sure. And this cyst tradition carries on right into the Iron Age, although there are changes in construction, and the grave goods start to include iron tools and different types of jewelry. We also see bigger Iron Age cemeteries emerge, like Jabila and Ain Dalia Kabira.
So a long, evolving tradition with these cysts. Regional variations, connections outwards. Okay, now what about hypogea? That's a new term for us. What are those?
Hypogea are basically underground tombs, cut into the rock, but more elaborate than simple pits. They represent a new burial tradition that shows up in the early 1st millennium BC, particularly on the Achakar Plateau.
Okay.
And their closest parallels seem to be in Phoenician settlements, like Tramar in southern Iberia.
Phoenician influence then.
That's the suggestion. But what's tricky is that the grave goods found inside these hypogea are actually very similar to what you find in cyst burials from the same time. So it makes it hard to say for sure who was being buried in them. Were they local people adopting a new style, Phoenician settlers, or maybe a mix? It's unclear.
Another puzzle piece. And we also need to cover those maybe more distinctly North African types, tumuli and bazinas.
Right. Tumuli mounds of earth and stone and bazinas, which are sort of like truncated pyramids. These are definitely characteristic North African burial types. You find them all over. Camps argued they had a local origin. In Morocco, tumuli are especially common along the Atlantic coast.
And when do they date to?
Well, that's been debated. Traditionally, they were linked to the 1st millennium BC, mainly based on pottery found with them. But examples from the Sahara and Iberia suggest that tumuli in northwest Morocco might actually be older, maybe 3rd or 2nd millennium BC. Yeah. And the fact that some tumuli have been found built over earlier cyst burials, well, that hints maybe they evolved from cysts or maybe developed alongside them, or perhaps just reused the same sacred spots. We really need more systematic excavation and, crucially, more radiocarbon dates to sort out their timeline and evolution properly. Missouri has an example, the Beni Medan Bazina.
Okay. And speaking of Missouri, that sounds like a really enigmatic site. Tell us about that one.
Missouri is truly remarkable. It's a big megalithic complex, several clusters of standing stones. And the most famous part is the so-called cromlech of Missouri, 176 standing stones encircling this huge tumulus, this massive mound.
176 stones.
Yeah. Montalban, who excavated early on, thought the tumulus had retaining walls, maybe an inner structure a bit like a bazina. And there was a Libyan inscription found there, which suggested a Mauritanian period date much later. But there's conflicting info about whether there was a central cyst burial inside the tumulus. More recent research suggests maybe 2 main phases of construction. An earlier phase, when the standing stones were put up, apparently shaped using stone tools. And then a later phase for the tumulus itself, which seems to incorporate stones cut with metal tools.
Ah, so the stones might be much older than the mound.
Possibly. There aren't really clear parallels for those standing stones in the Mauritanian period, but they do look similar to 3rd millennium BC sites in Atlantic Europe.
Interesting.
So one idea is that Missouri might have been a really important gathering place, an aggregation site used for a long, long time. And then later it was reused as a burial ground, maybe by elites wanting to link themselves to this ancient sacred place. Its location on a major ancient route near other burials definitely suggests it was part of a wider ritual landscape.
Wow, Missouri sounds like it still holds a lot of secrets. Okay, let's circle back to those exciting new discoveries that kicked this off. The new stones, cemeteries, and especially that Darua Zaydan date. What more can you tell us?
Okay, so our recent survey work focused on an area called Crossroad A, identified as important through that GIS route analysis. It led us to 3 previously unknown cemeteries.
Okay.
Darua Zaydan, which had a single cyst, Uladzin, which had a tumulus and cysts, and Oued Siar, which had tumuli and clusters of cysts.
And looting was an issue?
Unfortunately, yes. We saw evidence of looting at these sites. Our excavation focused on the Darua Zaydan cyst. It was trapezoidal and had this sort of crescent-shaped pit just outside it. Now, interestingly, there were no human remains inside the cyst itself. It was empty.
Ah, like those potential cenotaphs.
Exactly. But we found scattered bone fragments outside the cyst, and those provided the crucial radiocarbon date, 2119 to 1890 BC.
The big one.
The big one.
Yep.
This makes it the first radiocarbon-dated cyst burial in Northwest Africa. It puts it squarely in the Iberian Early Bronze Age, contemporary with that Benzu cave burial we mentioned.
Huge implication.
Absolutely. It helps us understand the timing of beaker pottery in the region, and it strengthens the links between metal grave goods found here, like those palmella points, and finds from the early Argaric and Ferradera cultures over in Iberia. Oh, and isotopic analysis on the bones suggested the person ate a mostly land-based diet.
Fascinating detail. That one date really anchors so much. And it shows how even small finds can be revolutionary. What about the cemeteries that were revisited? How bad was the damage from looting there?
It's pretty bad in some cases. The big Bronze Age cemetery at El Mers seems to be completely gone, destroyed by urban sprawl.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And the sites at El Meriz and Jabila have been severely damaged by looting. At El Meriz, our work turned up a copper awl and some pottery bits that connect to Arshakar and other caves. But then going back through Montalban's archives, we found records showing that El Meriz was probably looted of a dagger or maybe a halberd and palmella points. Yeah, so that significantly increases the number of metal objects we know came from that site, but which are now lost. It just highlights the devastating impact of looting on what we can learn.
A really stark reminder of that irreplaceable loss. And you also mentioned finding new standing stones.
Yes, 2 previously unrecorded ones. They were located along what seemed to be potential ancient routes. Their positions suggest they were strategically placed, and they're near concentrations of cemeteries, which again supports that idea of them being markers, maybe for routes, maybe for territory.
Okay, so putting all this together, the new stuff, the revisited sites, the dating, how are we now thinking about these cemeteries and burial traditions in Tangier between 3000 and 500 BC?
Well, the sheer variety of burial practices during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC is really striking. And it clearly mirrors what we see across the Strait in the Gibraltar area and down in the Guadalquivir region of Iberia.
Right.
Now, one puzzle is that while researchers expected to find Bronze Age settlements directly linked to these cyst cemeteries like you see in southern Iberia, those links are proving elusive in Tangier.
Why might that be?
Several possibilities. Maybe the settlements were more ephemeral, harder to find archaeologically. Maybe erosion has wiped them out. Or maybe, just maybe, Tangier City itself sits on top of a key undiscovered Bronze Age settlement. We don't know yet. The concentration of cysts around the Tahdart area without obvious settlements is also curious. We do get better context later in the Iron Age. Recently identified Iron Age settlements are starting to match up with the later cyst cemeteries, like at Kanua, where you have both the settlement and the cemetery.
Okay.
The placement of cemeteries and standing stones along routes definitely points to them acting as territorial markers. And another really interesting thing, these Bronze and Iron Age cyst cemeteries seem largely confined to the Tangier Peninsula itself. This raises the fascinating idea of a funerary coin.
A funerary coin, meaning like a shared burial culture.
Exactly. A shared way of doing things related to burial. specific to this area. And it might even link to social structures that get mentioned much later in classical texts. This shared tradition hints at significant cultural exchange, maybe different groups living side by side, sharing some practices.
That's a really compelling idea. So what does all this tell us about the societies themselves? The social, cultural, economic life back then?
Well, the general lack of really large nucleated settlements or big defensive structures might suggest communities were perhaps organized more around kinship family lines. And the variations we see in burials might reflect more about individual actions or lineage status rather than a big concentration of power like you see developing in early Bronze Age southern Iberia.
So maybe less hierarchical, at least initially.
Possibly. It's also possible the Tangier Peninsula was kind of on the edge, peripheral, to a bigger social and economic world centered either in southern Iberia or maybe down in the Garb Plains of Morocco. And those parallels between Iberian and Northwest African cysts, they still raise big questions. How did that happen? Was it direct contact, people moving across the strait? Or did similar ideas just develop independently?
Tricky questions.
Very. Ancient DNA evidence is starting to help, though. Studies like the one at Loma del Puerco in Iberia suggest there was mixed ancestry across the strait, so people were moving. What's also interesting is how, even when Phoenician influences arrive later in the first millennium BC, you still see a lot of continuity in local rituals and burial sites.
They didn't just get swamped by the newcomers.
Doesn't seem like it. It suggests locals were actively adapting things, reinterpreting foreign goods and ideas within their own traditions, which is quite different from southern Iberia, where cyst burials largely vanish and cremation takes over.
Oh.
The fact that Iron Age cemeteries in Tangier get larger and more concentrated might signal bigger settlements developing, maybe shifts in social organization. And maybe the gradual fade out of cyst cemeteries and the rise of tumuli reflects deeper socioeconomic changes. Perhaps the emergence of elites leading towards the kind of Hellenistic monarchies we see later. It's a different path than what happened in the northwestern Mediterranean.
A complex picture of local traditions interacting with wider trends. Okay, let's widen the lens again. Beyond burials, what about other ritual places? And the rock art?
Definitely. Besides cemeteries, we have other hints of ritual activity. There was a stray find, for example, in the Lucas River. A copper or bronze axe found with a really unusual type of rapier, a Ballantober type.
Ballantober.
Yeah, it's unique in Africa, but it has parallels way over in the British Isles and in the Huelva area of Spain.
Wow. Atlantic connections again.
Exactly. And its location suggests it might have been a ritual deposit thrown in the river intentionally. Caves and shelters also clearly held sacred meaning in North Africa. A great example is the Idols Cave at Oshakar. They found clay figurines there, maybe linked to sun worship, farming cults, fertility rituals, that kind of thing. Before the recent work, Megara Sennar I was the only known painted rock shelter in northwest Morocco. It has art spanning a huge period, late Stone Age right up to the Mauritanian period, with styles similar to art in Cadiz, Spain, and other parts of Morocco.
And engraved art. Carvings.
Yes, engraved art too, particularly cup marks, these small circular hollows pecked into rock surfaces. They've been found at several open-air sites like Bubana, Jababra, Ziatin, and also at Mazura. Cup marks are found all over Morocco, actually. Their meaning is debated, maybe linked to rituals with water or liquids, marking special liminal places, defining territory.
Lots of possibilities.
Right. There are other carvings, too, at Mars IV and near Beni Chekshim, and there are some really unique engraved standing stones, stelae, found near Rabat further south. They show human figures, concentric lines, but they don't have obvious parallels right nearby.
So a real variety of ritual expression beyond just burials. And you mentioned significant new rock art discoveries as part of this recent work.
Yes, this was a major outcome. The survey turned up 24 previously undocumented rock art sites. 24.
That's huge.
It really is.
Yeah.
Most are clustered around that key ancient crossroad we identified, and also near the known site of Megara Sennar I. They include more cup marks, both open air and in shelters. And incredibly, 16 painted rock shelters. Some even have both paintings and cup marks.
16 new painted shelters.
Yeah. It dramatically increases the number known for the Tangier Peninsula. It really positions this Rif region as a super important area for studying North African rock art.
What kind of art is it?
It's varied. The themes and styles show influences from Iberian schematic art, but also from sites further south in Morocco. We even found some later Arabic inscriptions at some spots, showing people continued to see these places as special. Some of the new sites seem quite early. They have these paired dotting patterns that look similar to late Stone Age art elsewhere.
And different from Megaris and R1.
Yeah. Some differences, yeah. The new painted sites seem to exclusively use red paint, whereas Megaris in R1 also has later stuff, like horses and riders, sometimes in other colors. So it suggests these new sites cover a long time span, maybe starting as far back as the late Stone Age.
Incredible, a massive addition to the picture. So how does all this Tangier rock art fit into the wider world, artistically, culturally?
Well, when you compare motifs from the new sites to Atlantic Europe, you see these intriguing overlaps again. Things like meandering lines, dotted patterns, those bitriangular shapes, human-like figures. And there are also connections south to the Sahara and the Atlas Mountains, motifs like squares filled with dots or lines. Some things seem unique too, like certain circular arrangements of cut marks that weren't known before in Northwest Africa.
And the sites with both painting and cut marks.
Those are really significant. They hint at potentially complex rituals happening there, using different kinds of symbolic marking. As for interpreting cut marks, generally ideas range from them marking sanctuaries or liminal boundary zones to being part of territorial marking or ceremonies. But the overall similarities in rock art styles across Atlantic Europe and Northwest Africa really do suggest some kind of shared cultural network, an exchange of ideas, maybe beliefs, back in prehistory.
A flow of ideas, maybe people too, that were just starting to grasp. Okay, one last piece of the puzzle. The relationship between the rock art and the cemeteries. Is there a connection? Did people make art near where they buried their dead?
It certainly looks that way. We're seeing a definite pattern where many rock art sites in the Tangier Peninsula are pretty close to cemeteries.
Like the Idol's Cave.
Exactly. The Idol's Cave at Achakar has art, and it's in an area with burials. The Zayatin Cup marks overlook several cyst and tumuli cemeteries. And significantly, several of the new rock art sites are also near the newly documented cemeteries. Often you can literally see the burial site from the rock art shelter. Gar Ahurl, for instance, has a clear view of the Kanua Cemetery.
Wow.
And remember that clustering of new art sites around that major ancient crossroad? That's highly suggestive too. We see similar patterns rock art near cemeteries in Iberia and also down in the Sahara, places like the Middle Draw and Tamanart Valley. So this spatial link strongly suggests a symbolic connection, that these different ritual acts making art, burying the dead, were happening in related parts of the landscape. Studying the Tangier rock art further holds real potential for understanding these wider connections and the beliefs of these ancient people.
This has been absolutely fascinating, a real deep dive into a place that clearly was way more connected and significant in the ancient Mediterranean than we often give it credit for. So if there's one key thing we should take away from this.
I think the key takeaway is just how much the Tangier Peninsula's strategic location mattered. From around 3000 BC onwards, it was clearly a hub of increasing interaction with the wider world. And its archaeology, this rich, diverse record, it really cuts across our modern ideas of continental divides. The parallels with Iberia, with the Sahara, they're undeniable. They speak to deep, long-lasting connections.
And just to quickly recap the big finds.
We've seen this incredibly diverse ritual landscape. Different burial types, cysts, pits, caves, tumuli, a huge amount of newly discovered rock art, other ritual sites, and those new discoveries are crucial, especially that first radiocarbon date for a cyst burial and finding all those new rock art sites. It's powerful evidence for connections, shared culture, stretching across the Strait of Gibraltar and much further.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, what's a final thought, maybe a lingering question you'd like to leave us mulling over?
Well, what really strikes me is how local practices seem to persist in the Tangier Peninsula, even with later external influences like the Phoenicians arriving. It suggests the local people weren't just passive recipients. They were active, resilient, shaping their own culture, adapting things on their own terms.
Right.
So I'd maybe encourage you, the listener, to think about how these findings challenge those simpler stories we sometimes hear about colonization or cultural change in the ancient world. It's often much more complex, more negotiated, and it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What else is out there still waiting to be found? What other discoveries could further illuminate these interconnected societies, maybe even overturn some really long-held ideas about the ancient Mediterranean?
Definitely powerful food for thought. Well, if you are intrigued and want to explore this further, we absolutely recommend checking out the research we've discussed. Links are in the show notes. It's a fascinating area, and as we've heard today, discoveries are still being made that are genuinely reshaping how we see the ancient world.